Hi everyone. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and their individual contributions to the civil rights movement. So as we'll see as we go along today, they've each got two different approaches to protest and what they want out of it. So just to start with, we'll do a really simple analysis of what each of them want. Okay, so if we do a little comparison, there's only a couple of things that I want to draw attention to. So with Martin Luther King, if we're looking at religion, he is a Christian. Malcolm X is a Muslim. And they also have differences in terms of the methods of protest. Okay, so Martin Luther King is all about peaceful protest, whereas Malcolm X uses violent protest. I don't know why my pen's doing this. I need to try and get it fixed. And then finally, the last thing that I want to draw attention to is Martin Luther King wants equality. Okay, between white and black people in America, so the end to segregation, whereas Malcolm X is looking for black superiority. Okay, double T there. So we've got some fundamental differences between the two of them. Now they do meet, they don't work together, they don't have the same goals in a way, the same principles, but they do both want to enhance the status of black people in America, but they're going to go about it in very different ways, as we're going to have a look at. So let's have a look at where we stand at the end of the 1950s going into the 1960s to sort of set the scene from where they come in. Now we know from the last video that Martin Luther King gets quite a bit of recognition after the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, and then his career starts to grow in the 1960s. So in 1957, Eisenhower passes a Civil Rights Act to ensure that all African Americans could exercise their right to vote. Okay, so they were allowed to go and vote from 1957. However, again, to what extent that actually influenced what was happening is questionable. So the act banned any person from interfering with any other person's right to vote, made discrimination illegal, and created the Civil Rights Commission to prosecute those who deny people their rights. So the idea is that the people who were intimidating, who were lynching these black people and preventing them from voting would be held to account and would be punished for doing it. So that should have been a deterrent. However, in practice, little was done to enforce the act. And as we mentioned in the last video, this is partly because a lot of the people in charge of the legal system were racist and against and privy to this idea. They were against black people voting, so they kind of turned a blind eye to it. But it showed that the government was no longer willing, and this is really important, I'll come back to that in a second, to accept that the southern states could ignore federal government when it came to the rights of African Americans. So the southern states had kind of been playing their own game. As we saw at Little Rock, they were calling in the National Guard against the government. So the government said, right, look, you've got to pay attention now. We are the government, and you have to abide by our laws. But what really does instigate change is the government, is the people in power. They are the ones who can enforce this change. And if they're willing to change, and if the president is now passing civil rights laws, we may start to see some change in the years to come. All right. So this is a big step forward because it's kind of saying to the southern states, look, you can't operate separately to the rest of the country anymore. So Martin Luther King and his methods. So we've got sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches. Now they're all non-violent methods. We're going to come to later on an example of when Martin Luther King doesn't use violence, but does instigate violence. And some people argue that that was either right or wrong in when he did that. But let's have a look at what he was really known for, his methods of protest that he was known for. So they did not stop after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott because that was one problem in one place. This needed to be a nationwide change. And they continued to organise marches, so these different methods of protest, boycott, so boycotting different things, and demonstrations wherever local laws discriminated against African Americans. So they are targeting the places they're doing it. They're not just doing it anywhere. They want to make changes in specific places that are not following the law. In 1 year, King travelled 180,000 miles and made 208 speeches campaigning for civil rights. So very famously, he makes his I Have a Dream speech at Washington in 1968, but that's not the only time he speaks. He's very passionate about this. And this is one of the things that really drives the civil rights movement, is his drive behind it. In 1961, both Black and white civil rights campaigners organized freedom rides. So this is where they traveled around the southern states, sitting next to each other in whites-only sections of the buses, in areas where the local authorities had refused to desegregate their buses. All right. So again, in places where this was a problem, the freedom rides were them sitting on the buses next to each other in protest in the white-only area. So to raise awareness, okay, that this was still happening and it shouldn't be. But they faced threats and violence as they travelled, but attracted a huge publicity. Now, when we're thinking about why the civil rights movement came in the 1960s as it did, one of the reasons is the world is opening up and we've got TV at this time. People are starting to get coloured televisions. We're starting to see newsreels from across the world. And people have more access to this kind of media. So it gains a lot of international attention. So the idea that these freedom rides are happening anyway gains massive public attention from around the world, but also the violence that they have and the threats that they receive back from them really show that America has a problem. All right. And it really shows America to be quite a backwards country in terms of the way that they're treating the Black people who are living there. So many white people, especially in the North, were disgusted by the violence, right? So again, they may not necessarily know how people are treated in the South. Until this point, America is a big country and a lot of poor people in it who may not have had access to this kind of information before. So another common non-violent method was to organise a sit-in, okay? And that's exactly what it sounds like. You sit in somewhere as a method of protest. So African-American students, sometimes accompanied by white students, right? And this is another big thing that we need to not underestimate, that this is not, the civil rights movement is not just a Black movement. You don't have to be Black to be a civil rights activist, like you don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. Okay, they are supported by both sides, and that obviously makes the movement stronger as well. So they would take a seat in the whites only part of a cafe or a restaurant and refuse to leave, right? So very similar to the sit-ins, but in a different setting, highlighting a different area where discrimination was still prevalent. This was first started by 4 African-American students at a Woolworths food counter in 1960. And within 18 months, over 70,000 had staged sit-in protests across the South. Over 3,000 protesters were arrested, okay? But this only drew attention to the discrimination. So getting arrested isn't necessarily a bad thing because it gains publicity, okay? And that's what the suffragettes used to say, no publicity is bad publicity, all right? You're getting attention no matter what you're getting the attention for. So in May 1963, King organized a non-violent protest march in one of the most segregated cities in the USA, Birmingham, Alabama. So about 30,000 people took part in the march, and the police, under orders of the police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, attacked the protesters, peaceful protesters, they didn't have weapons, with dogs, water cannons, tear gas, electric cattle prods, and batons. Hundreds were arrested, including 900 children. All of this was shown on TV. Now, you've got to think here, who comes out of this looking badly? Is it the peaceful protesters, or is it the police who are arresting 900 children? So after days of protest, Kennedy sent in troops to restore order and ordered Birmingham City Council to put an end to segregation. Kennedy later said that the civil rights movement should thank God for Bull Connor. Now, he's saying that tongue in cheek, right? He's saying because of him, they gained a lot of publicity. They gained a lot of recognition. And we're going to talk about that in a second, again, the stuff around Alabama and Birmingham. But in the summer of 1963, King organized the largest civil rights demonstration in American history. So he spoke to 200,000 people gathered around the Lincoln Memorial in the center of Washington, D.C., and gave one of the most famous speeches in history, which is his I Have a Dream speech. What's important about this figure is that 50,000 of them were white. Okay, so again, he's not only talking to the Black people, because you need the white people's attitude to change as well to really make a difference. So that's really significant that 50,000 of those were white. Now, in 1965, King organizes a peaceful protest march from Selma to Birmingham, Alabama. However, when the marchers reached the outskirts of Selma, they were brutally attacked by local police. This became known as Bloody Sunday. And they had organized another march along the same route a few weeks later. And he then gave a speech to 25,000. And soon after, a civil rights campaigner was murdered, a white one, in a drive-by shooting by members of the KKK. And this enraged President Johnson, who we're going to look at in the next video. He was a supporter of the civil rights movement. And what I was saying before about King instigating violence comes back to this. Some people say that he organized this march purposefully in Alabama because he knew that this man would attack. So he kind of purposely sent people there to be attacked to show that this would happen. Does that make sense? So it's not like he didn't cause the violence, but he knew the violence would happen and he sent people there regardless. So you could argue that that's not a method of peaceful protest because he knew that violence would be instigated. But then at the same time, we can see why he did that and what his strategy was there. So we've got a strong supporter in JFK. He began a tour of the southern states as part of his re-election campaign. The problem for Kennedy was he couldn't get anything passed because he doesn't have the support of the southern politicians. So he goes to the south trying to get the support of the south. Unfortunately, it doesn't work and he is assassinated because of the fact that he's supporting the civil rights movement and he's touring the south about it. But more about Kennedy and Johnson in the next video, and we'll refer to civil rights again then. So just to have a look then at Malcolm X and Black Power. So the Nation of Islam is also known as the Black Muslims. This is founded in the 1930s and it's arguing for separatism, right? So not equality, but keeping them separate. So kind of like segregation. It said that white society was racist and corrupt and rejected Christianity. So this is another reason why the two can't work together. Remember, MLK is a Christian, as a white man's religion. They urged African Americans to follow Islam, and the best known member was Malcolm X. And he's a member of the Black Panther Party. So they're formed in California in 1966. They had around 5,000 members by 1968. So we're not talking significant numbers here. And this is one of the problems of the Black Power movement. It was extremely militant, which means they are using violent protest. They rejected King's non-violent ideas and they needed to protect themselves from white racists by using violence if necessary. Okay, so they say we can't make any changes without using their methods against them. All right, they don't think, it's kind of like the suffragists and the suffragettes. They don't think that the civil rights movement is going far enough, right? They think they can only make change by using violence. So by 1965, non-violent action had achieved a great deal, but not enough in the ideas and of the Black Power movement, and they remained angry and frustrated. There's still massive inequality, right? There's still poverty, there's still low wages, inadequate housing, and poor education. Not much has actually changed. They argued that the civil rights campaign had done little to deal with the day-to-day issues, and many African Americans took to looting, which is stealing, and arson, which is setting fire to buildings. So between 1965 and 68, there were riots in most of America's major cities. And most of these were caused by frustration over living conditions and a feeling that police didn't protect the rights of African Americans, which is true. And King showed that himself when we went on his peaceful marches. So they don't think change is happening quickly enough, and that's why we've got a resurgence in the Black Power movement. But again, like I said, low numbers compared to the civil rights movement. So Malcolm X is born as Malcolm Little, and his family moved several times because of threats from the KKK. So you can see how his upbringing and his childhood influences why he kind of sets up this more militant stance. So he leaves school at the age of 15 and becomes involved in drug dealing and burglary. He goes to prison in 1946, where he changes his religion to Islam and joins the Nation of Islam. He then changes his name to Malcolm X because Little is a white name given previously to his family through slavery. He becomes a leader of a mosque in Harlem, New York, and a powerful speaker. He does become less extreme towards the end of his life and leaves the Nation of Islam in 1964. And he wants stronger links between Africans and African Americans. And again, he is shot and killed. And 3 members of the Nation of Islam were convicted of his murders because he's slightly straying from their beliefs. So we're talking very extreme here. So King is assassinated also. So as we see there, 1965, Malcolm X is killed. 1968, Martin Luther King is killed in Memphis in the south of America in Tennessee while standing on a hotel balcony. He's shot by a white racist named James Earl Gray. And there are massive riots, and he is remembered across the country, across the world today. And then in the next, so if we just look down here, we can see sort of how different acts came into play. So 1964, we've got a Civil Rights Act that prohibits racial discrimination and prejudice in employment. So that's saying you can't say, I am not going to hire you because you're Black. You could say that previously. And again, the reality is a lot of people would not have been hired because they were Black, but that could no longer be given as the reason, right? So the discrimination doesn't go, just the formality behind it has to change. It gives Black pupils the right to use any public facilities and establishes the Equal Opportunities Commission to look into complaints of discrimination and prejudice. Then 1965, we've got the Voting Rights Act, which is only passed into law in 1968, that gives all Americans, so all Americans, including African Americans, the right to vote. Interracial marriages are legalized in 1967. That's recent history, that's quite mind-blowing, that, isn't it? That it was only 1967. And finally, 1968, the Fair Housing Act makes racial discrimination illegal when buying and renting houses and other property. So again, you could no longer cite, I don't want somebody Black living in my house as a reason not to have them if you are a landlord. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just now means that it's not the reason given on the piece of paper. Okay, so we're going to have a look in the next video at JFK and LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. We'll touch on civil rights again and what each of them did for it, but then also we'll look at more ways in which they tried to help America in the 1960s. Okay, so thank you for joining me in this video, and I will see you there.